Well, welcome everyone to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly get-together of both believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. We alternate, so we do an atheist book one month and then a Christian book the next month. We do try to keep the conversation civil and to be friends. We've got a lot of new people coming in since we've switched over to Zoom during this pandemic. And so we want to make some new friends and be friendly. So please keep all your comments and questions into the respectful category. And we got a great guest with us. I want to introduce you. My name is James Walker, and I'm president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical Christian apologetics ministry focusing primarily on interfaith evangelism. So we reach out to people of other faiths, religions, Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, but we also very interested in the topic of atheism, agnosticism, and so the book club is a way that we work together to be able to have hopefully interesting conversations, discussions. And so I'm one of the co-founders of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. I'm the Christian half of the equation. And our other co-founder is Bill Cluck. Bill Cluck is a former Christian, now atheist. We came up with this idea through a friendship that developed about 4 years ago. We've been doing the book club for, I think, 3+ years now. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Bill Cluck, our other co-founder. Bill Cluck is with the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Bill, you want to introduce our special guest this evening?
Frank Turek got his PhD from Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. He has a website called crossexamine.org, which I looked on today. They had some really interesting articles on the birth of Jesus, is the census real and whatever. So some interesting, check it out, some interesting stuff. He also speaks at colleges, campuses throughout the nation. And the really cool thing about Dr. Turek is most Christians' questions are an anathema to him. Frank Turek embraces questions, and I really admire that. So also he's written the book Stealing from God, which we covered a few months ago at the book club, several months ago, and just fantastic book, really a joy to read. And he had some very good points, I've got to admit. So just a great guy and is not afraid of controversy. He's debated some of the top atheists, Michael Shermer, the late great Christopher Hitchens of all people. So fantastic guy. We loved him at the book club. And here, back to you, James, another great Christian who embraces questions instead of running through them.
Well, thanks, Bill. And so one of the things I hope we find out later this evening from Frank, was he ever hitch slapped? I was kind of wondering if that ever happened to him. So that may be a question we come back to later. But I have a couple of housekeeping things I'd like to do first to kind of talk about what we have coming up. Real excited about some things that we're working on and doing. Let's see if we can go over here. We have over a year, probably close to 2 years worth of past book clubs on our website at atheistchristianbookclub.com. You can go watch those, including we had Gary Habermas 2 months ago talking with us about near-death experiences. Very interesting conversation. And then last month for November, we had the book Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian. Seth Andrews of The Thinking Atheist was with us. We had that. That's if you want to go back and watch those. I think you'll enjoy that. But I'm real excited about what we have coming up. So in our January Atheist and Christian Book Club, we're going to have joining us again. We're going to have John Loftus. We had John with us back last year. Actually, he was with us twice, once by video and once in person. And John talked about his book, The Christian Delusion, last year. Well, he's going to be talking about his latest book now, The Case Against Miracles. So that's going to be our January book. We're going to be January 7th, again, 7 p.m. It's going to be another Zoom meeting if you want to join us for that, and talk with John about the case against miracles. And then the following month, we want to kind of do the opposite. We want to talk about the case for miracles by Lee Strobel. We're working on some of the details of that right now. I don't know that we're going to be able to get Lee. Actually, he's putting together a documentary on the book right now, and it's got several deadlines he's working on. We may not be able to get Lee, but I think we're going to be able to get somebody that's in the book to come on and with us and talk about the other side of that story. And in fact, John Loftus, his book is primarily, as the title implies, aimed at this book. Although I think he does rely heavily also on some of the previous atheists as well. But anyway, I think this is going to be a very interesting next couple of months. And then we've got one more for you, probably March 4th at 7 o'clock Central Time. We're going to have both an atheist and a Christian joining us for our discussion. And it's going to be Graham Oppy, who is a well-known atheist philosopher, talking with philosopher Tim McGrew, Christian apologist and philosopher. We're going to be looking at their book. They wrote two of the chapters in the book, The Four Views of Christianity and Philosophy, which our friend Paul Gould was the editor, one of the editors of that book. And I think it was also Richard Davis. And what we're going to do on that is we're going to hear from both perspectives. Now, Tim is has been on with us several times at the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Tim McGrew is professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University. He's contributor to the book The Four Views, wrote the chapter. He argues for what he calls the convergent model of philosophy when it comes to Christianity. He, of course, is going to confirm Christianity in his section. Graham Oppy is an atheist from Australia. He's a philosopher. His main area of research is in philosophy of religion. He currently holds the post of professor of philosophy and associate dean at Monash University, and many other positions as well. So his section is called, in the book, is called Philosophy Trumps Christianity. Now, the good news is, best I can tell, that has nothing to do with our current U.S. President, Trump. So it's going to be a great discussion. And the other good thing I like about this book, it's not real dense. It's pretty easy for a philosophy book. It's pretty approachable. So it's going to be, again, sometime in March, probably March 7th. And we'll have both of them joining us by Zoom to discuss their perspective chapters. So I'm excited to hear from Frank, and again, we had him. It was maybe one of the highlights of the year for the book club when Frank joined us in person to talk about his book Stealing from God. Very, very interesting. People still talking about that, and so I'm going to pitch it back over. I know that Bill Cluck has some questions he has. I do have some questions for you, Frank. But for all of our club members, and we now have 71 people in the room, and more trying to get in, it looks like. So what we want to do is, after Bill asks his question, I'm asking mine, have your questions ready. If you will text that question. Is that how we're doing it, Brady? Just have them text that they have a question?
Yeah, if they want to just, they can put it out there for everyone to see, or they can go to me, Brady Blevins, or Daniel Ray, and let us know their question, and we'll make sure we get them in the queue, and then we'll announce everybody for their when it's time for their question to come up. That way we don't have 85 people trying to all talk at the same time.
Right. So if you stay muted and then have your question, again, it's text it to in the Zoom text. You can text either Brady Blevins or Daniel Ray. They're both co-hosts, and they will get you in the queue. You don't have to put a whole paragraph out there, just a couple of words to let us know what your question's about. We're going to try to get to as many of you as possible, but we're already in the largest meeting we've ever had. So, Bill, do you have any questions for Frank?
Okay, the first question concerns, I got two, the Origin of Life chapter. Frank mentioned that you have a problem with the DNA in the Origin of Life. You need the DNA to give the instructions to make the proteins, but yet DNA is a protein. So right off the bat, you have a a problem with that. Plus, the DNA, what forms proteins and so forth, and amino acids, is the order of the nucleotides, the guanine, adenine, and so forth, the 4 nucleotides. But the problem is, it's not the chemical makeup of the DNA, it's the order. So it does, I can see Frank's point, it does seem to imply intelligence. Also, you have the problem of, in the origin of life, of the cell membrane, which is very complex. Darwin didn't have the microscopes to see that, where it's semi-permeable, so it lets the good stuff in, and the toxins and so forth, it lets out. But it's very, very complex. And of course, we know they've compared it to a small city, the chemical machinery to make up the ribosomes and mitochondria and so forth. It's extremely complex. Also, you have the enzyme problem. Enzymes are proteins, and you need the enzymes to actually speed up these reactions in the cell. And if you don't have them, then everything stops. And they actually proofread, which is just amazing. They actually speed up the process and proofread. So my question to Frank is, just give it straight, Frank. What is the probability that the life originated randomly without divine guidance?
Well, I think the more important question is have I ever been hitch slapped? I thought that was the first. So let me just deal with that, because many of you won't know this because you weren't there. My first debate ever, my first formal debate ever, I've had many debates prior to this, mostly with my wife, and I've lost them all. But my first formal debate was with Christopher Hitchens at Virginia Commonwealth University in September of 2008. And I saw Hitchens a lot on TV. Of course, I read his book. And in the green room beforehand, I went in, and there he was sitting there, and I said, "Hey, Christopher, I'm Frank Turek. I'm debating you tonight. I know we don't agree on the God issue, but I like a lot of what you say." I said, "I'm kind of a fan." And he kind of shot me a mischievous look, like he was looking over his glasses, and he went, "The night is young."
Classic.
So yeah, I got the first thing I said to him, I got smacked. Okay? So, but both the debates I had with him are on a YouTube channel, so you can see that there. With regard to your question, Bill, regarding the origin of life, you made a pretty good case already that it seems to require some sort of intelligence. And I think one of the problems that goes on in a debate between Christians and atheists, or theists and atheists, is the whole question of a God of the gaps. We haven't found a natural explanation for this yet. And if we're going to plug God in, immediately we might be accused of committing the God of the gaps fallacy for good reason, right? We used to think that Thor made lightning. Okay, so now we realize that, okay, Thor doesn't make lightning. He actually makes thunder. No, we've realized that, okay, there's natural causes for this, and we shouldn't immediately just posit some sort of God because we can't explain it. Now, I think when you look at the origin of life problem, and of course, I'm not an expert on this, I'm standing on the shoulders of so many other people, but I don't think we just lack a natural explanation for the origin of life. I think we have positive, empirically verifiable evidence for some kind of intelligent being. And one of the pieces of evidence is, as you mentioned, the DNA genetic code, the genome, appears to be a software program that requires all the letters to be in a set order. The other thing you alluded to briefly was the idea that you have a chicken and egg problem, that DNA needs RNA and RNA needs DNA, and you need a cell wall for all this. It seems to be a chicken and egg. How do you get all this without some sort of intelligence? So if that reasoning is correct, it does not prove that God exists. It proves there's some sort of intelligence out there. Whether it's the God of the Bible or not, that's another question. It could be the God of the Bible, but you don't get enough information from any intelligent design argument to conclude it's God. You might add that to a cumulative case for God, which is what we try and do, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. But a fair criticism of any intelligent design argument is, okay, it doesn't get you all the way to God. No, it doesn't. It could be God, but it doesn't go far enough. In fact, no argument gets you all the way to God. You need to make a cumulative case, and that's what we try and do, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist.
Well, and I forgot to mention, too, all the amino acids have to be left-handed. You got the homochirality problem, and when they did it synthetically, they had a mixture of left and right-handed amino acids. But just real quick, what's the chances? Is it 1 out of 100, 1 out of 1,000,000? I mean,
well, I would, if you look at Fred Hoyle and Wickramasa, I'm trying to remember his last name. It's a long last name. We have it in the book. He basically says that the odds, according to his calculations, are so small it's not even worth talking about. But again, it seems to me a difficult thing to try and calculate odds when you don't have a mechanism. How do you calculate odds when there's no mechanism by which you can say these things came together? I mean, if you want to say the mechanism are the 4 natural forces of nature, gravity, strong and weak, nuclear forces, and electromagnetism, I don't even know how you'd put odds on that, but somehow they do, and they say it's, of course, extremely small. Now, Doug Axe, who has written a book since we wrote I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, says just to get 1 protein fold, there aren't even enough atoms in the universe, or our galaxy anyway, to demonstrate the remoteness of this possibility. He says there's not enough time, there's not even enough atoms in the galaxy. If you were to spend, I can't remember his exact numbers, but if you were going to assume so many reactions per second in the 4 billion years of the Earth, you would never get even a protein fold, much less life.
Okay.
So he's trying to put numbers to that.
So there is a chance. All right, thanks. That's great.
That's right. Thanks, Jim Carrey.
My next question concerns, I read your chapter on the resurrection of Jesus, which is our focus chapter.
Yes.
And you gave evidences, and there are some evidences. Dale Allison, in his new book, Resurrecting Jesus, has said that he might have been buried by Joseph of Arimathea. And I think he believes in the empty tomb, which is remarkable because that does fulfill the Isaiah prophecy that he would be buried in a rich man, and he couldn't, facilitate that. That was beyond his control. But we do have problems with the resurrection narratives. Luke has, I think, 2 people at the tomb. Mark has 1 shadowy figure. John has 1 Mary coming to the tomb. Some of the other gospels have a slew of Marys. You have 1 gospel. This is huge. Mark has the tomb open before the women seek it, and Matthew has it opened in front of the discoverers of the tomb. The big problem, though, is in Mark, our most unvarnished gospel, you have no post-mortem appearances. The women go out and say nothing to anybody. Go forward 15 years, and you have all these appearances of Jesus. You have in Matthew, him appearing to the disciples in Galilee, and then we have a contradiction in Luke. You have him appearing in Jerusalem. And of course, the scholars realize, I think Dale Allison said this in his book, Resurrecting Jesus, that these Jerusalem appearances, like the road to Emmaus, that these are fiction. They're just made up stories by the gospel writers. Obviously, John with his fish fry at the Sea of Tiberias, Nathaniel wasn't a fisherman. These are legendary, writings years after the event. So, and with Matthew, you have, of course, the earthquake, the Roman guard. None of this is in Mark. So, wouldn't you, and not to mention the dead saints, which is crazy going it. So with all these problems, what percentage would you give? Because Tim McGrew has said it's above 99%, which I just think is insane. Swinburne, or whatever, Rich Swinburne out of England says it's 99%. I just think they're ignoring all the evidences like Dale Allison puts forth, like Paul, for instance, does not seem to know about the empty tomb, does not seem to know about the miracles, does not seem to know about the teachings of Jesus. He just seems to be unaware of all these things. So with all these problems with the New Testament, what is the probability? What would you give as a probability that the resurrection is true?
Well, let me ask you a question this way. Eyewitnesses of the Titanic disagreed on how the Titanic sank. Some said it went down whole, others said it broke in two and went down. So what should we conclude from that, do you think, Bill?
Oh yeah, when that you have differing views, but these are not tangent. Well, that's at the heart of the matter to the Titanic, and there are evidences it was birthed in Jerusalem, where it could have been easily falsified. You have the skeptics, I think you alluded to in the book, James and Paul, that became believers. James, the brother of Jesus. So there's evidence, but if you read Dale Allison's book, he lists all the evidences against, and that's what I wish you would have done in your book, is tell us the disconfirming evidence. Okay.
Well, I guess my reason for bringing up the Titanic thing is because just because you have differing perspectives on details does not mean that the central event did not happen. Everybody agrees the Titanic sank. They may disagree on how it sank. Now, we can sit around and say, how can we harmonize these? Well, it could be because people had different perspectives on the Titanic going down. Maybe the guy that said it went down whole had a perspective from the bow of the ship, where the people who said it broke in two were on the side and they could see it break in two. That could be one explanation. What they all agree on is the Titanic sank. And I think what is misunderstood by a lot of people, and this is mostly Christians' fault, because we've come up with the idea that the reason Christianity is true is because the Bible's inerrant, which is silly. That's circular reasoning, and it's assuming something that you haven't proven yet. And inerrancy is not required for Christianity to be true. In fact, there were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written. Why? There was no Bible to be inerrant at that point. The reason they were Christians is because they witnessed the resurrected Jesus, not because they read it in a book somewhere. So you don't need an inerrant Bible to say that Christianity is true. Now, we could go through each of those very good differences that you brought up and see if there's an explanation for them. I don't think we have time in this session to go through all those. But let's grant, for the sake of argument, that everything you say there is a direct contradiction. Does that mean the resurrection didn't occur?
No, but you have in the end of Matthew, the last chapter of Matthew, you have the risen, glorified, second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, appearing before the disciples. And what does it say? Some doubted. Well, if they doubt, how in the world am I supposed to believe 2,000 years later?
Well, actually, I think, Bill, that is actually an excellent point that I was going to bring up in my little intro, which I guess we'll get to here in a few minutes. When they say they're doubting, that's what we would call embarrassing testimony.
Absolutely.
I don't see how a group of Jewish believers in Yahweh, number one, are going to make up the resurrection story, but then secondly, say that some of them doubted it if they're trying to pass off a lie as the truth. That would be disconfirming evidence of what they're trying to put forth. And there's so many embarrassing details in the text that it makes me think that these people are not inventing this. They're just being honest with what's going on. I mean, many people will lie about something that makes them look good. Nobody will lie about something that makes them look bad. And yet the New Testament writers appear, if we're saying this is forged, they're lying about things that make them look bad. It just doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So when I see in Matthew 28:17, some believed, but some doubted, and Jesus is standing resurrected in front of them, I go, they're not inventing this. They're just being honest.
That's an evidence, but it cuts both ways. It's an evidence form. But anyway, I know we got a lot of questions. So would you give it like 50-50? I give it like 15% at best. What would you give it, the chances?
Well, you see, I'm not an expert in probability theory, and Tim McGrew is. But let me say one thing about probability theory that I do know about, and that is this, that if you're going to try and use probability theory, you have to not only give the probability of having the evidence that you do have to say that, say, Jesus rose from the dead, but you also have to use a probability factor that says, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, would I have all this evidence? So you sort of need the other side of the
That's a good
coin
point.
in order to
Yeah.
put that
Right.
probability into the calculus. And
Right.
when you look at what I'm about to go through here, I think it's very unlikely that you would have this evidence if Jesus did not rise from the dead. So that's why people like Swinburne and people like Tim McGrew come to such a high probability, because when they put their estimate in as to, would we have early testimony, embarrassing testimony? Would these guys go die for it? Would we have these undesigned coincidences? Would we have the explosion of the church out of Jerusalem when it could have been refuted by an empty tomb? Would we have all that if Jesus hadn't risen from the dead? And you look at it that way and you go, well, that number's got to be pretty low. If that number's pretty low, the probability of the resurrection gets pretty high. And that's why they come up with those numbers.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Frank. Appreciate you answering
Thank you,
my question.
Bill. A fellow North Carolinian.
That's right. Raleigh and Charlotte. Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Bill, and for the answers, Frank. I am getting some feedback that a lot of people didn't get to read the book. Of course, the whole book is open for discussion. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, but we were primarily wanting to focus on the resurrection chapter.
James, I don't know if you know this, that you cannot be saved unless you read the book.
Oh, yeah.
Well, at least half of our participants probably concerned about that.
Read the book right now.
Well, isn't it more important that you buy it than you read it? That's what I always wondered about. So, but
I got to feed my hungry kids. You're right.
But what I want to do, though, is a lot of people didn't get a chance. They just found about the book club today, so they may not have gotten the book yet. They haven't had time to read even that chapter yet. Could you take about 5 or 7 minutes and kind of just give a synopsis of the things that you covered, the minimal facts, I don't think you got in that chapter into the fulfilled prophecies, but just kind of give us a synopsis of what you deal with in that.
The book, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, is 400 and something pages. There's no way, obviously, I can sum up the whole thing. Those of you that do have the book know that it goes through 12 points to show that Christianity is true. I'm summing them up here in 4. When I present this to a college audience, I'm just doing these 4 points. No one's going to remember 12. If you want the details, you can get the book. But I try and establish that truth exists, that God exists, that miracles are possible. And the New Testament is true in the sense that it gives us enough information to know that Jesus rose from the dead. It doesn't have to be inerrant. We're not trying to say that it is inerrant in order to get to this point. We're just trying to see if it has good, historically reliable information. And the reason we're trying to get to this point is if Christianity, or I should say, if the resurrection's true, then I think Christianity's true. Of course, if the resurrection's false, Christianity is false by Paul's own admission. And you could then get to more about the Bible just on what Jesus teaches. Because look, I just have a personal policy. If somebody rises from the dead, I just trust whatever the guy says, okay? So if truth exists, if God exists, if miracles are possible, then we can see if the greatest miracle in the New Testament has occurred, and that is the resurrection of Jesus. Now, obviously, I don't have time to go through all 4 of these points. Let me just say one thing about point 2. Does God exist? Bill and I were talking a minute ago. There is evidence that there's intelligence out there. I think if you add that to the cosmological argument that the universe had a beginning, and the teleological argument and the moral argument, I think that you can make a good case, which is what we try and do in the book, that there's a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator who created all things and sustains all things. And if that's the case, then the next question, are miracles possible, I think is quite easy, because if God exists, then miracles are possible. And a lot of times I ask people, what's the greatest miracle in the Bible? And they'll say, well, it's the resurrection. And I say, no, the greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Because if that verse is true, then every other verse is at least believable. If that verse isn't true, if there is no God, if there's no other evidence for God, then obviously miracles are not possible. And the answer to question 3 and 4 is no, can't be true. But if the first verse is true, then every other miracle is at least possible. And we even have atheists admitting, like Stephen Hawking famously said, that almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Well, if that's really true, if space, time, and matter had a beginning at the Big Bang, that whatever created space, time, and matter must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, and also intelligent to have a mind to choose to create. And so if there really is a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause, I always ask people, who is that? And of course, most people will say, well, that's God. And then they'll ask, well, how do you know it's the Christian God? And the answer is we don't. We don't know it's the Christian God at this point. This God does not, or this argument doesn't get you all the way to the Christian God. It could be the Christian God. We need more evidence. We need to look and see if Jesus really is who he said he is. And so for that, we go to question number 4, which is the New Testament really true? So we're saying it's possible that it's true if questions 1, 2, and 3 are answered yes. Okay, so let me just give in 5 minutes some of the evidence that I think the New Testament is telling the truth, particularly about the resurrection. And again, I can't spend any detail on it, just to kind of give you an overview. It's all alliterated here with the letter E. The first thing is we have early sources. All the New Testament documents, maybe with the exception of 1 or 2 books perhaps, are written prior to 70 AD. And the sources in those books are even earlier, particularly the creeds. We have scores of eyewitness details. We can get into that if you want during the Q&A. We have many embarrassing stories. In fact, Bill brought up one of them, the idea that the resurrected Jesus is standing in front of the apostles at the Great Commission, and they're doubting he's resurrected. There's other things like Jesus is considered out of his mind by his own family who want to seize him and take him home in Mark chapter 3. You have his own brothers not believing in him. That's embarrassing. You have Peter, their leader, saying, Lord, I'll never deny you. He winds up denying him 3 times, which is not a good thing for their leader. You have all the disciples, maybe with the exception of 1, running away at the crucifixion. And who are the brave ones? Yeah, the women are the brave ones. Now, who wrote the New Testament down? Men. Now, what man is going to invent that he was hiding for fear of the Jews why the women went down and discovered the empty tomb, right? No man is going to invent that. In fact, we learn later that Jesus not only at the crucifixion has all his disciples run away, the women are the brave ones that stay around. And you got to ask yourself, why would they say the women were the first witnesses if a woman's testimony in that culture was not considered on par with that of a man? You wouldn't do that. If you're trying to make this up, you'd never say the women were the first witnesses. You'd only say the men were the first witnesses. I actually had a woman once say to me, she said, Frank, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. I had never thought of that. Anyway, much more on embarrassing testimony or embarrassing stories. Also, you have excruciating deaths. Now, I think a lot of times Christians overstate the case here. We do not have evidence for every one of the 11 remaining disciples that they all died martyrs' deaths. We have good evidence for 4 or 5 of them from the first century, particularly people like Paul, Peter, James, the half-brother of Jesus, James, the brother of John, or the son of Zebedee, and maybe one other in the first century. But we don't have that kind of evidence for all of the disciples. But 4 or 5 of them is pretty good. And we don't have any evidence from anywhere in the ancient world where any of them ever recanted. Also, we have something called embedded confirmation. That's what I call it, but you probably know it by undesigned coincidences. And by the way, Tim McGrew and his wife Lydia are experts in this. Lydia wrote a book on this. This is kind of hard to describe in a short period of time, but this is probably the best evidence you've never heard of that the New Testament writers are independently witnessing the same historical events. And if you just take a few minutes and Google undesigned coincidences, you can read about these for free on the internet. Undesigned coincidences, check those out. I call it embedded confirmation. There's also expected predictions that deals with Old Testament prophecy. If I only had one Old Testament prophecy to make my case on, it would be Isaiah chapter 53, written 700 years in advance. Also, Daniel 9 is quite good. There's extra biblical writers, people like Josephus, Suetonius, Thallus, Phlegon, household names you've already heard of. If you take away their brief references to Jesus and the apostles, you get a storyline congruent with the New Testament. They're not saying they believe Jesus rose from the dead, but they are admitting that the disciples believed Jesus rose from the dead, and they were willing to die for that belief. Now, I hasten to add that none of these people were eyewitnesses of the disciples. Some of them lived coexistently with the disciples, like Josephus did, but they were not eyewitnesses of Jesus. Josephus was born in 37 AD, and of course, Jesus probably crucified in 30 or 33. But they're all saying the same basic thing the New Testament says about the storyline of Jesus. And then number 8 is the explosive growth of the church in Jerusalem. It's really hard to explain how you could have, coming out of Judaism in Jerusalem, a new faith system that ultimately takes over the Roman world, a faith system that had enemies like the temple Jews and the Romans, who could have immediately squashed it by going to the right tomb and taking out the body. And they couldn't do that because Jesus's tomb apparently was empty. It would have been easy to do that. It would be easy to falsify Christianity by simply going to the empty tomb and saying and parading Jesus's body around the tomb, around the city, I should say, and they couldn't do that apparently. So it's hard to explain the explosive growth of the church with a tomb that was known, especially given the fact that the Romans and the Jews wanted to squash it and they couldn't. Now, let me just, in the last couple of minutes, just point out that we've got just a couple of options here with regard to the resurrection. There's only 2 possibilities. Here they are. Either it happened or it didn't happen. Does anyone see any other possibilities? No, there's no other possibilities. Either the resurrection happened or it didn't. If it happened, obviously Jesus is Lord. If it didn't happen, then we have probably 2 possibilities. The disciples lied about it, or they were mistaken. Now, remember that all the writers of the New Testament, with the exception of Luke, were Bible-believing Old Testament Jews who believed Yahweh was the true God, and they were part of God's chosen people. They did not believe that a man could be God. They thought that would be blasphemy. They did not believe there would be a resurrection in the middle of time. They thought there would be a resurrection at the end of time, according to Daniel chapter 12. But the idea that they would come along and invent a story about a man claiming to be God who resurrected in the middle of time doesn't fit with any of their theological paradigms. And if they did that, they had no motive to lie about it because they got beaten, tortured, and killed after being excommunicated from the synagogue. And they had a big motive to deny the resurrection because by saying it was true, they got excommunicated, beaten, tortured, and killed. You don't invent religions that get yourself killed unless you're going to get either sex, money, or power for them. And the apostles didn't get sex, money, or power for saying that Jesus had risen from the dead. They got the opposite of that. Now, Paul had power as a Pharisee, yet when he became a Christian, he lost power and became persecuted. So there's no motive to invent this story. Now, maybe they were mistaken. The problem is, as I just mentioned, they had no expectation of a resurrection. And if they were mistaken, they easily could have been corrected by the enemies of Christianity, just showing Jesus's corpse, just taking the empty tomb, going to the tomb and showing it wasn't empty and saying, look, he actually is dead. So stop all this nonsense talk about the resurrection. Now, the last thing I want to say is this, because I think this is too often not said before we get to your questions and comments. I want to ask a question. Which came first, the resurrection or the reports of the resurrection? Now, I think this is pretty easy. Just if I was to ask the question, which came first, the sinking of the Titanic or the reports of the sinking of the Titanic? Well, it's quite obvious. The sinking of the Titanic came first. So the resurrection came before the reports of the resurrection. And what I want to say is, I know this is going to sound heretical for you people who believe that the Bible's inerrant like I do, but it's not. Just stick with me. Christianity is not true because a series of documents we put under one binding we call the Bible says it's true. In fact, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. You say, well, how can that be? Because Christianity did not originate with a book. Christianity originated with an event, the resurrection. There were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written. Why? Because they didn't become Christians because they read about it in a book. They became Christians because they witnessed the resurrected Jesus. I mean, Paul obviously was a Christian before he wrote the book of Romans. Why? Because he witnessed the resurrected Jesus. Matthew, the same way. John, the same way. They witnessed the resurrected Jesus, and then they wrote those things down. So I think we could put it this way. The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. You would not have New Testament documents written by Jews in the first century, people who didn't believe in a mid-period resurrection and didn't believe somebody could be God. They wouldn't have invented this unless they had good motive to do so. They had no motive to do so. They were just telling the truth. They had witnessed a resurrection, and that's why they wrote it down. And as I say, there's so much more evidence in the book for this, but that's kind of an overview. If I just have a few minutes with somebody to say, yeah, I don't think they made this up to get themselves beaten, tortured, and martyred. Instead, they wrote down what happened, despite the fact that it would cost them temporally, and it would actually cost many of them their lives. So there's a lot more details we can get into, but let me stop to share and we can go to your questions, comments, or criticisms.
Hey, thanks a lot for that, Frank. I do have a question or two for you, but I'm going to put mine on hold because we've got a lot of people anxious. Sure. And they've been waiting a while to get to you. I do have one more housekeeping thing, though, I would like to do to help us out. We have a little poll. Choose two simple questions. How do you self-identify? Atheist, agnostic, Christian, other? I'd rather not answer. And this will help us see who we're reaching and kind of give us a feel for that. And then the other one is, would you be willing to help with some of the club's advertising and Zoom expenses? Again, if you want to make a donation, I was going to say if you're a Christian and want to donate to that, but then Bill Cluck would be offended because he believes that the atheists can outgive the Christians any day. So we don't want to do that. So, but it's just a little poll that's going to do that. If you could just let me know where you guys are coming from, I'm going to launch that now. And then I'm going to ask, Brady, are you going to be the one that's going to kind of queue up the questions, and then we'll start taking questions. So here's the poll.
All right. Again, our first question comes from one of our longtime atheist members, Chris. Chris, the floor is yours to ask your question.
Sure. Well, first off, James, that sounds like a challenge. I don't know if that was you're going for there, but we'll see the numbers. It'll be okay. But Frank, thank you for joining us again. I wanted to ask. I had a question about the morality chapter, actually. So this is the second book we've read by you. Both of them have chapters about morality in them. And in both cases, if I'm remembering Stealing from God correctly, there's a lot more time spent in decrying supposed shortcomings of non-theistic subjective morality than ever actually showing that objective transcendent morality is actually a thing. In this book, it seems like a lot comes down to everyone just knows it. It's written on your hearts. Those who deny it want to sin, stuff along those lines. But coming from the outside looking, that's not really, I don't really find that a satisfying answer. Like you can say that about pretty much anything. But I was hoping you kind of go into a little bit more detail. Like, is that literally all it is? There's a couple more points in the book, but they also kind of come down to what would happen if there wasn't objective morality, like we wouldn't have human rights, we wouldn't have a sense of justice, something like that. But that kind of goes back to decrying subjective morality. So I was curious, am I missing something here? Is it really just, we just know it is? No,
I think you're right, Chris, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. We're taking more of the C.S. Lewis approach, that this is intuitive to everyone. But in Stealing from God, we're dealing more with the ontological foundation of morality. And so there is a difference in approach between the two books. I agree with you there. But one thing that I think that everybody intuitively understands is that torturing babies for fun isn't just a matter of opinion, right? We all know it's wrong. And if that's really the case, then that moral intuition can't just be given to us or can't be true if there's no transcendent standard beyond us. Otherwise, it's just my opinion or your opinion against a baby torturer's opinion. And so one of the things that I think is so self-evident is that there are objective moral values. The only question is, how do we explain that effect that we have? How do we explain that effect? What is the cause? Because that's what we're doing when we're trying to figure out certain attributes about the world. We have an effect, we're trying to reason back to the cause. And it seems to me there's no way to justify that torturing babies for fun is really wrong unless there's an objective standard of rightness to which we're obligated. And so it seems to me that that's self-evident. I don't know how you come up with an objective morality by atheistic materialistic terms. Maybe you have a way of doing it, but I can't see how that can be done.
Well, that's kind of what I was kind of repeating. What my concern was is that, okay, you're saying that torturing babies is objectively wrong, and I'm sure there's a wide agreement that it's wrong, which
right.
we can talk about why that is. But saying it's objective morality, once again, it's based on a objective moral standard. Once again, that is something that is being put out there but not backed up. I don't see why that could be based on, like, we have natural empathy as human beings to care for other human beings.
But that wouldn't make it wrong. That would just be how you know it. It wouldn't really be wrong. And empathy, by the way, does not give you any moral commands. You could empathize with, I don't know, you could empathize with somebody who has just, say, discovered that, say, her husband was cheating on her, right? You can, oh, I'm so, but that wouldn't tell you whether or not you ought to sleep with that woman, right?
Right, but if torturing babies isn't wrong in some, grand, objective, transcendent sense, who cares? Like, we all, like, if like, empathy may not get you to an objective moral standard, but it can lead to large areas of agreement among individuals that we may all come to we may all have the same opinions. They might just be our opinions. We can gather other people who share those opinions and form a society based on those opinions. And I don't see what's problematic about that if it's not, it's God-given standard as opposed to a standard that we set for ourselves.
Right. I'm not really talking about whether the implications of it are good or bad. And by the way, when we say good or bad, we're implying a moral standard, right? Okay. I'm not as much concerned with that as trying to explain why it is that torturing babies for fun is wrong. Why is that the case? And let me quote, this is from Stealing from God, so this is not a quote from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, but Louise Anthony was an atheist who debated William Lane Craig, and toward the end of the debate, she admitted something that I think is quite profound that actually hurts her case being an atheist. Here's what she said. She said, any argument for moral skepticism will be based upon premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values themselves, unquote. I mean, we already know that torturing babies for fun is wrong. We would need some sort of incredible defeater to give us, to cause us to doubt the idea that torturing babies for fun is wrong. And no such defeater exists. So why would we believe that torturing babies for fun isn't wrong in the absence of a defeater that says it's not wrong?
Well,
in other words, you already know that torturing babies for fun is wrong. So why wouldn't you adjust your worldview to account for the fact that torturing babies for fun is wrong, rather than maintain a worldview that doesn't explain why torturing babies for fun is wrong?
Right, but now you're just saying, okay, kill or torturing babies is objectively wrong.
Yeah,
Prove me
I
wrong
am.
about that.
I am.
That's
I'm
not the
saying
same.
murder's wrong too.
That's
Yeah.
not the same as making a case for the actual objective wrongness of it.
Well, you could make a case that, okay, there is a God, and go down that road and say that God is the standard of goodness, and we ought to do the good and shun the evil, and therefore we're morally obligated to follow God's nature. But you already know that torturing babies for fun is wrong from an epistemological perspective. So why doubt that knowledge? Why not just go and say, okay, I know that's true. Why is it true? It's true because there is this essence out there known as goodness, God's nature, to which we're obligated to order our lives. That's all I'm saying. In other words, God, a theistic God, and again, this doesn't necessarily prove the Christian God, but a theistic God better explains our sense that morality is objective than any other explanation. So why would I abandon that? For what reason? That's my question. Does that make sense?
I feel like I'm going to keep going back to my saying the same things over again, but
That's
I know
okay.
I know we have other questions here, so I'll just
No, I
let it go
appreciate the
there.
question.
I appreciate you
Actually,
answering.
Chris, morality is the question that comes up more than any other question. On a college campus, 70% of the questions are moral. They are, because we believe in morality so much, and we believe in it so much, we criticize the Bible over it, right? We talk about slavery and violence in the Old Testament, and what does God have against homosexuality, and why does God seem, at least according to some readings, that, what women are on the same par as men and all. These are all good questions, but they all presuppose an objective moral standard. Because if there is no objective moral standard, there's no way to criticize anything in the Bible.
Okay, well, like I said, I've said my piece. I appreciate you.
Oh, thank
answering the
you.
question,
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, I know we have the other chat, so if you want to go on to the next person, then
Thanks,
Thank-
Chris.
Thank you for your question, Chris.
Good question.
All right, we're going to bump this guy up because he is our author for next month's book, John Loftus. John, you can unmute yourself, and I know you had put a question.
Yeah, can I be heard now?
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
hey, John, I can hear you.
Okay.
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
I don't know why. I'm not so good at this, but hi, Frank. How are you?
I'm fine, sir. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I've read part of your books. I studied under William Lane Craig, who studied under your co-author. Sorry to hear he passed away. I'm presently in conversation with his son David. He texted me on Facebook, and we've gone back and forth. He thinks he's going to evangelize me. I think, I'm not sure, but he's a great guy, and you know him, I'm sure.
Yeah, I know David. Yeah, he's here in Charlotte.
Yeah. Well, I was just observing your chain of your arguments. They're sequential. Build on top of one another, and you know a lot. I have to congratulate you on all you know. I'm being a little bit sarcastic. I hope you don't mind.
No, it's fine. I'm from New Jersey.
What's the end result, that conclusion you come to after going through the steps, the arguments? Isn't it diminished with each step? If you were to put a probability on the first step, put a probability on the second, third, fourth. I mean, it would seem like to me the end step, the conclusion, Jesus is God, and I need to be saved by his atoning death on the cross. Wouldn't you think that by the time you get to the end result, the probabilities, you can't have 100% probability on each step, but if you say, well, I'm 90% probable on the first, 90% probable on the second, 90% probable on the third, and you do the math, you don't have much left when you get to the final result. That's my question: is how sure are you of the final result?
Yeah, good question, John. Now, again, I'm not an expert in probability theory, but I've talked to people who are, okay? And correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe you know this better than I do. But if you have steps that are independent and let's say you put them at, just say 50% or 71% or just north of 50, and you multiply them all out, you come up with a very high probability that your conclusion is true, much higher than the individual probability. So let's say they're all 70%, and you multiply all the probabilities out, you wind up with 90 something percent that your conclusion's true. So again, I'm not the expert in this. I don't use probability theory to try and prove my point. I'm just trying to use what I think is common sense. Would they do this if they were making it up, that kind of thing. So if you have some other insight on that, I'm totally open to it, but I don't really use any probability theory in any of my books or any of my reasoning. Someone like Tim McGrew does. In fact, Tim McGrew is so good at probability theory that he teaches it to William Lane Craig. Okay, so.
No doubt. The one step that concerns me, I think that you should look into that. I think that there are steps that require previous steps. That's why you put them in the order that you do. So just look into that, see what you come up with. Ask Tim about it if you want. I've written a few books, and I look at each one of those steps and I find problems, some serious problems with some of them.
Hey, John, can I say one other thing about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I forgot one other thing. When you get older, you start to lose your train of
I do all the time.
I had something there about the problem. Oh, well, yeah. If you look through the whole book, I don't have enough faith to be atheist. We have these 12 steps, these 12 points.
Yeah,
but really, when you boil them all down, there's not 4, there's only 2. And these are the 2. God exists and Jesus rose from the dead. Because obviously you can't have a resurrection unless God exists. And Christianity can't be true if God doesn't exist. So obviously you need to establish that God exists. And then you can see if Jesus rose from the dead. And so at the end of the day, it's what we call a 2-step apologetic. Can you show that God exists? And if you can, then it's possible that God rose Jesus from the dead. Those are the 2 main steps. The other thing I wanted to say about probability theory is the fact that probability theory seems to be evidence of a theistic universe. You say, why is that? Why does math apply to the real world? Eugene Wigner back in 1961 wrote that famous article, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. Why does mathematics describe the world so well? And why can our minds understand the real world out there using the language of math? That doesn't appear to be something that could be described or ontologically put forth by no mind. It appears to be the product of a mind. Math itself appears to be the product of a mind. So I think when we're using probability theory, I think what we are actually doing is we're presupposing this is an intelligible world, which would need some sort of cause. And our minds are built in such a way that we could ascertain those truths about the real world. So I think it's a backhanded way of admitting that there's some sort of intelligence out there. But go ahead. Yeah.
You're the speaker. I'm sorry if I started to interrupt you.
No, I'm done. Go.
Okay. If I try to stick to the things I think are important, and while that question you raised is important, for me the important part that gets to the heart of things is the miracle step, and that is you kept talking about evidence, and then we can talk about probability theory, I suppose, and we can talk about math. I'm not a mathematician. I didn't do too well in high school math, which is the last math class I ever had, and I'm 66. So, but the miracles thing. There really is. There are 2 kinds of evidence. Basically, there's testimonial evidence, and then there's objective evidence. Now, objective evidence is what, if you go into the courtroom, you see, well, here's the objective evidence for the crime, and then you have testimony, and then you question the testimony. We don't have any objective evidence for any miracle in the Bible. DNA evidence. We don't have any forensics evidence. We don't have any of that kind of thing. We don't have any cell phone videos. All we have, is testimony. And we don't actually have firsthand testimony. Even Michael Licona says so in his book on the resurrection. He says, there's a lot of things we wish we had, but we don't. And he goes through a list of those sorts of things. He says, we don't even have any, eyewitness authors. So what we have is secondhand testimony at best. And what it boils down to is the Gospel of Mark, which, I heard earlier that Robert, I think his name is, or Bill, he said that, it stops short in Mark of having a resurrection sequence. So, well, and then there's no resurrection sequence in Q. There's no resurrection sequence in Mark. And there's, so anyway, besides that, there's no objective evidence. All we have is secondhand testimony at best. And I want to have a question for you, and then I'll let you, have the floor. What would it take? There's two kinds of claims: an extraordinary claim, and then there's an extraordinary claim of the extraordinary character, and that would be a miracle. And I'm going to give you the difference. An extraordinary claim would be that I sank 18 holes in one on a standard golf course, and I come up to you and I tell you about that, and you wouldn't believe me unless there was some kind of objective evidence for it. And then if I were to say, well, I sank 18 holes in one on a natural golf course, but between each hole, I took up wings and I flew to my next hole. Well, that would be a miracle claim. Now, you wouldn't believe me on the first claim. Why would you believe me on the second claim without objective evidence? And I'll let you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think let me make sure that the terminology is right. When you say objective, you really mean empirical, right? Am I understanding that right?
Well, the five senses plus any augmentation by microscopes or telescopes.
Right.
Or other
Well,
kinds
I would argue that we do have empirical evidence for the greatest miracle in the Bible, and that is the creation of the universe. I would argue the Big Bang cosmology, which we can witness right now empirically. We can see the redshift in the light. We can see the expanding universe. We can measure Einstein's theory of general relativity. We can measure the radiation afterglow from the initial Big Bang explosion and the great galaxy seeds. We can look at the second law of thermodynamics and know that everything's running down. I think we do have empirical evidence for a beginning. And that's why even atheists are admitting that. Atheist cosmologists, not just Hawking, but Alexander Vilenkin and many others. So I think there is empirical evidence for a beginning. And that is the greatest miracle, because if indeed the first verse is true, then a resurrection is easy. Now, the second claim regarding eyewitness testimony, I don't know if Mike would agree with what you just said, Mike Licona from his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, because in fact, Gary Habermas and I in the past couple of days have been going back and forth over atheists admitting eyewitness testimony in the New Testament documents, particularly in the creeds, like 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-8, the earliest creed that we have that deals with the evidence for the resurrection. So I'm not quite sure Mike would necessarily agree with your assessment there. I personally think there's eyewitness testimony in there, as I put out in chapter 10 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I mean, there's 59 historically probable or historically accurate eyewitness claims in the Gospel of John. There's 84 in the second half of the book of Acts. I think there is eyewitness testimony in there. And it really, also, if you look at undesigned coincidences, which I just mentioned earlier, it's really difficult to explain how these writers came to the conclusions they did and wrote down what they did unless they were witnessing the same historical event, given those undesigned coincidences. I'll just give you a brief example of this. Just one off the top of my head. In one place, Jesus is on trial with Pilate, and Pilate says, the Jews are claiming you're the king of the Jews. Is that true? And Jesus says, I think he says this in Luke, he says, you have said so. And Pilate immediately says, I find no fault in this man. And you're going, wait a minute, he just admitted the charge. How could you find no fault in him? It seems counterintuitive. It seems like he came to the wrong conclusion. You go and read the same account from John, and John adds a little bit more detail, because Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, I am, but my kingdom is not of this world. And now you understand why Pilate says, I find no fault in this man. This guy's kind of a loony, in other words. He is a king, but it's a king and not of this world. So he's no threat to Rome. He's no threat to the Jews. There's no problem here. I find no fault in this man. In other words, they have testimony from this event, but they are not describing it in the same way, because two writers describing the same event rarely describe it in the same way. And it seems odd that they would, it's hard to explain how they would have these, John kind of clarifies Luke unless they're talking about the same event and they had either eyewitness testimony to the same event or they knew eyewitness testimony to the same event.
Well,
so I think there is eyewitness testimony in there, and it's really difficult for me to believe that they would have invented this given the fact that it got them beaten, tortured, and killed. And I saw somebody in the chat here saying, well, sex, money, and power, what about revenge? Why would they do that? Well, that's part of the power thing, okay? Power comprises a lot, you know? I want to have power over somebody else, so I'm going to get revenge. This is what J. Warner Wallace talks about, the cold case homicide detective. He says, whenever I find a murdered body, I know there's only 3 reasons why that guy's dead. There's not 1,000 reasons. There's just 3, one of 3, or a combination of the 3. There was either a sex issue, a money issue, or a power issue. And if you think about that, that's the reason any of us do wrong things. We're trying to get those good things, sex, money, or power, but we take shortcuts to get them. So you always have to look at the motivators. Last thing I want to say to your scenario there, John, you talked about flying from one hole to the other. Yeah, I'd go, well, yeah, that is pretty odd. The kind of miracles, though, that Jesus does are in 4 categories because he's demonstrating he's the Messiah. First of all, he's sinless. That's one of our problems. Second of all, he heals the sick. That's another one of our problems. Thirdly, he has power over nature. That's another one of our problems. Natural disasters can hurt us. And finally, he has power over death. So sin, sickness, nature, and death are the 4 problems we have here on earth. Jesus isn't doing card tricks. He's not flying from one golf hole to another golf hole. Jesus is demonstrating that he is the Messiah. He's the one that can correct how this universe has gone bad. And of course, many of his miracles are predicted. They're in a theistic context. They're not random. They're in those 4 categories for a reason.
Thanks for the question, John. That was good. But this is also a little preview. If you guys come back in January, John's going to be our author. We're going to talk about his book, The Case Against Miracles. It dovetails into what we're talking about now because the resurrection, of course, is a miracle. So you'll get to hear more from John, and he'll be able to build his case a little bit better. Hopefully, you'll have a chance to read the book before
Hey, James.
then. Yeah.
Can I just bring on one of my colleagues because he has a point he wants to make on Mark? His name is Ryan Cruz. Just it'll be tangential to what we're talking about. He's on our board at Cross-Examine. So Ryan's a student at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's an apologist himself, but he wanted to make a point about Mark. So Ryan,
that would be good. Let's do that
real quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys, for bringing me on. Appreciate it. One thing that I've heard a couple of times, and so I just wanted to comment on it. I think both John and Bill brought up the mysterious ending of the Gospel of Mark, how Mark seems to end with no resurrection appearance. And something that I want to basically invite you guys to consider is the fact that even in Mark's account, there's an empty tomb at the end. And the problem is we still have to explain why is that tomb empty. And so if you think about what are our different competing hypotheses for how this tomb ends up empty, well, either the disciples stole the body, that's one option. The Jews stole the body, which doesn't really make sense, but is another option, I guess. Or Jesus rose from the dead, or any of these other things that you can come up with here. Now, given the fact that, we have good reason to believe that there was a guard posted on the tomb, the Romans don't want Jesus to come back to life. They don't want him to disappear because they have a vested interest in being the sole holders of power in Judea. Nobody's a king unless Rome appoints you as a king. Frank was just making this point about Pilate letting Jesus go. So they don't want a resurrection. The Jews, the high priests, they don't want a resurrection. They believe that this new sect of people that would come to be known the way later as Christians are heretical. And they are standing in the way of the program of God, which is very, monotheistic, focused on Yahweh, this new Jesus thing. This isn't good, right? So they don't want that either. So nobody in Jerusalem wants Jesus's body to go missing. And yet it does. Even in Mark's account, where there isn't a mention of an explicit resurrection, it goes missing. And so we have this task of testing hypotheses, right? In the same way that you would in any other field of inquiry. We have to ask, of all the evidence that we have, and we're only talking about one here, and this is just the empty tomb in Mark's gospel, but we could talk about all of them and all the other accounts that mention the empty tomb. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, which of these hypotheses explains all of this data best and has the least holes? Not that it doesn't have any holes, because we're talking about an event that happened 2,000 years ago. So we're not going to have complete information on everything that happened there. We know that that's already been brought up. But which one does the best job of explaining it? And I think there's a very good case that could be made that the resurrection hypothesis is the one that best explains how that tomb went empty. Now, like I said, there's more work that would need to be done to demonstrate that, it's not just Mark who says that the tomb was empty. We have to establish that Jesus was buried and then the tomb was in fact found empty. But Frank's made some great comments on that, so I won't belabor the point, but I did just want to point that out.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate you doing that. All right, our next question comes from also one of our longtime members, Ken Daniels. Ken, it's all yours, buddy.
Great. Thanks, Frank, for joining us to our illustrious club.
Navy, go Navy!
Yeah. It's my son is a Navy pilot, so he went to
excellent!
Naval
I was a naval flight officer. You know what Navy stands for? Never
you tell me.
Volunteer yourself.
Yeah, I don't. You have to tell me. All right. So my question is an observation, somewhat. It's that the case for the resurrection in your book is built largely on experience about the way things normally work. So people don't die for what they know to be a lie, for example, or people don't forget where they buried their deceased loved ones. Legends don't generally develop in just a few years, and people who are apparently moral don't make up or pass on true stories. So these are things that we kind of by experience know to be true or generally true. But while these are generally true, all of these are better attested than something like a bodily resurrection, which lies outside of all of our experiences. So for example, Christine Blasey Ford, who alleged that Supreme Court nominee Bart Kavanaugh she alleged that he had assaulted her when she was younger. She didn't withdraw her accusations even in the face of death threats. If someone had followed through with their death threat, would this have proved her story to be beyond doubt? Many Christians doubt her testimony, as they do the testimony of Georgia's Secretary of State, who has similarly received death threats for his stance that there was no significant fraud in the recent presidential election in Georgia. So we have people that stand their ground on their stories, even in the face of evidence or in the face of threats against their lives, and yet many Christians still don't believe their stories are true. So they're kind of belying their notion that this never happens. But I will say in your favor, I want to be a steelman arguer. I want to argue, put your best case forward. I thought your argument was pretty persuasive. Your comeback when you said that neither do we have any experience with life arising from non-life. So that's the most persuasive argument I can think of to my question. But in both cases, I don't think it's perverse to adopt a skeptical stance. I mean, we should be skeptical that life could arise from non-life. We should be skeptical that anybody would rise from the dead just because we've never experienced that. So that's kind of what I'm trying to argue, is that how can you build a case for something that no one has experienced using arguments that are based on our experience about what commonly happens or doesn't happen?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ken, but let me ask you this. If resurrections occurred routinely, what would the resurrection of Christ mean?
So I'm not God, so I didn't orchestrate the whole thing. It just seems that if it was, and you address this in the book too, but it seems to me that if it was so important to believe in the resurrection, if it was good enough for him to reveal himself to Paul or to Peter, then why not to me? I mean, he knows what's required to make me convinced of it. So, it just to make it be secondhand. Yes, I understand the arguments about the Holocaust, and we adopt the view that the Holocaust happened even though we weren't there. But something as important, that's eternally important to believe, like the resurrection, something that's otherwise unattested in our experience. It just seems that, yeah, it may have happened, but how do we have enough really, these arguments are good arguments, but they're like maybe 90% each of these, 90% probability of each of these. And as John Loftus was saying, you start multiplying these by each other, and you know, whether you add or subtract, it doesn't matter. Even if it's 99% certain that it happened that way, it's still less than 1% certain that even happens. That it's even something we experience. So you kind of weigh the two against each other, and you come out saying, well, it's not perverse to think that it didn't happen, that some of these other possibilities actually could have happened.
Yeah, it's always possible. Obviously, Christianity is not true. I agree with that. The question is, where does the evidence point most directly? And you seem to be now transitioning more to a hiddenness of God argument, if I'm hearing you right. That, okay, because my question had to do with, if resurrections occurred all the time, the resurrection of Christ would mean nothing to us, right? We go, hey, Jesus rose from the dead. So what? Uncle George just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. You know, in other words, it's got to be a rare event in order for us to go, wow, this is from God. So on one hand, it seems like we are penalizing God by saying, if it's too rare an event, we can't believe it. But if it's too common event, it wouldn't have the impact on us. So it needs to be a rare event in order for us to say, yeah, this is really from God. And so it just,
I don't disagree that
God can't win either way, right?
Yeah, I don't disagree that it has to be. I mean, I don't disagree with the point you're making about its rarity. I think what I'm arguing is the accessibility of it to us. That's why I brought in Peter and Paul, who had direct access to it, to the event.
Right.
Especially in the case of Peter, more so maybe than Paul. If you could maybe argue that it was a vision for Paul, but in their cases, they had direct access to it. So, you know, God was one who, if he made the world, he made history, he could have made everybody live all at the same time in the same, you know, and have direct access to the experience, or he could have revealed himself directly to me, like he did to Paul, for example. But that doesn't happen. So, yeah, it's an indirect answer to your question, but it's trying to get at what you're saying about the rarity of it. It can be accessible. It can still be rare, but what I'm arguing is it needs to be accessible if it's to be believable.
Well, let me ask this though, Ken, about this. Let's suppose you needed a particular operation to save your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't even know the doctor. You don't have any access to what he knows. You're just going purely on authority that he can save you, right?
Right.
Are you gonna at least say, okay, give me the operation, or are you gonna demand that he demonstrate to you that he can do everything he can do before he does it? He proves himself to you, or are you gonna take his authority and maybe other people who have had operations to say, hey, this guy's a good guy. Trust me, this guy can do the job for you. What are you going to do?
Well, we're operating in the realm of experience and probabilities. We know there are good doctors, and if everybody's saying he's a good doctor, I'm going to trust them.
In other words, you're using the eyewitness testimony of others for you to make a life and death decision.
But I think that's a category mistake because operations happen successfully all the time, whereas resurrections don't happen successfully. It's a different category.
Right. Well, if they did happen all the time, it wouldn't mean anything.
Right. But I mean, the resurrection may well have happened. You may be completely right.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is, because it's so little experienced in all of our lives and to our knowledge throughout history, it's not something that we can use probabilistic arguments to establish, right? It's each of the arguments that are being used are less than 100% certain. For example, the fact that people will die for what they know to be untrue, that might be 99% certain, but it's that 1% probability that it isn't certain is still, even as small as it is it's a bigger probability than that somebody would rise from the dead.
Well, no,
I won't use the word probability. I mean, less attested, I should say.
Okay, well, yeah, again, we're saying the same thing over again. If it happened all the time, it wouldn't mean anything. So it's got to be a rare event. But just most of the stuff we know on authority. We haven't experienced it ourselves. I don't even know who built this house I'm in now, but I trust it, right? Most of what we know, just given our limitations, we know based on authority of other people.
You're completely right. I agree with that.
Life is. Yeah.
You're completely right.
Now,
and I think, yeah.
Now, there are instances where people have said that God has appeared to them. Certainly people today from Muslim countries are saying that they can't get the gospel, but they're seeking the gospel and Jesus has appeared to them. This is happening in many different countries, according to eyewitnesses. So if God wants to get somebody's attention, he can. My personal plea to you is, first of all, thank you for being in this session and continuing to come to them. Obviously, you want to know the truth. Just keep seeking. Just keep seeking.
That's good,
I don't know that
good
we'll
question,
ever agree, but I
Ken.
appreciate the dialogue.
It's some good questions, and maybe if I could follow up a little bit, because I might be misunderstanding both Johnny and Ken a little bit on this. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that you have all these evidences, maybe 90%, 70%, but that they all are a chain, that each one depends on the previous one also being true, and if any one of those fail, the whole thing collapses like a house of cards? Or are you more arguing for a multi-strand cord, that if all these lines of evidence, only one of them needs to be true for Christianity to be true, but you have these other possible explanations as well?
That's a really good point, James. And I think the answer is there's some of both. There are some arguments that are dependent on prior arguments, each of which in the chain are less than 100% probable. So in those cases, you'd have to multiply the probabilities, and each successive probability is diminished by the multiplication of the prior one. But that, yes, there are others that are parallel arguments that make a strand. So it's not a simplistic. I can't say one way or the other. There's different arguments, some of which are in parallel and some are in series. But that is a good point to make.
And Ken, on the follow up on that, and again, I'm not into probability theory either, but wouldn't the math work the opposite if it was a strand argument or parallels? That having multiple possibilities, it expands the probability.
Exactly right. You're exactly right. Each one augments and strengthens the argument of the others if they're in parallel. But if they're in series, they actually diminish each other as you go along the chain. And we would have to look at each argument and in separately to understand whether they're parallel or a series. But I don't think that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. So.
All right, we're ready to move to the next one. We got Landon Tucker. Landon, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, and you.
Well, thank you, Frank. Thanks so much for joining. James, thank you so much for having this all put together. Frank, you mentioned all the different things in your book of the argument from morality, a cosmological. You have all these different arguments, and you get asked, especially on college campuses, all types of questions. And I wanted to know, whenever you deal with these, is there ever any in particular that you go, geez, this is the hardest kind of question to answer? I would imagine it would revolve around morality. But is there ever a time whenever you leave a college campus driving on the way home, you go, man, that was a tough one to have to try to answer?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. What's the hardest question? And my answer is that one. Because trying to think about, okay, what is the hardest question? I actually think that, look, you hear the same questions over and over again. So it's not like you're ever caught by surprise. You rarely are. The hardest thing is answering a question in 2 or 3 minutes, right? I mean, you could spend semesters on that. You could spend semesters on Ken's question about the hiddenness of God, right? You could spend semesters on probability theory, or semesters on miracles, as John had mentioned before. I mean, eyewitness testimony. My challenge on a college campus, especially if there's a line of questioners, is can I kind of give them just a nugget of an answer and then move on to the next person? You can't cover it all. There's no way of doing that. So that's the hardest thing, is answer it in 2 minutes. If God, why evil? How much time do we have, right? Or, okay, I know evil doesn't disprove God, but why did God allow this evil to occur? I usually reverse it and I say something like, why does God allow you to exist? Because you do evil every day, right? So do I. Yet here we are. Maybe because he's given us free will and he's given us the ability to love through that free will, which also gives us the ability to hate, which makes this a moral universe to begin with, which is why he had to intervene, by the way, because without him, we'd all be fallen and unable to save ourselves. So it's really a matter of how much time you have. If you have semesters, yeah, we can really unpack it. But just even on this forum, I mean, how long can you and I talk? Just a few minutes and we got to move on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your ministry.
Thanks, Lynn.
All right, Tina Flores, you're up next. You can go ahead and mute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Frank.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. I'm so excited to meet you. I always thought it would be in person, but here we are.
COVID. We can't do it in person right now, but hopefully soon.
Yeah. Your book is my favorite thus far, second to the Bible.
Thank you. You and my mom. Perfect.
Really? Well,
yeah.
Well, of course, your mom. So the question that I have is, it's on behalf of my dad. He doesn't even know I'm asking this or anything, but he's an agnostic, pretty hardcore agnostic. The only thing that we both agree on is that truth exists. He just doesn't know how to find it. So what it generally comes down to the most for him is the foundational question of, why would God create people who he knew would reject him? And I know that this answer involves free will, but couldn't he have just not created anyone at all? And I understand that this world, while not the best world, may be the best way to get to the best possible world. However, I'm having a hard time, and he's having a hard time, of course, understanding how we reconcile this with God's goodness. So from my limited perspective, if I were to know in advance that even one of my children would not accept Jesus and then they would ultimately go to hell, then I would not want to bring any children into the world. So if God is a complete being who doesn't need to have creatures, then why did he create them at all, knowing that not only some would go to hell, but the vast majority of them would go to hell? Why was this necessary?
Yeah, it's a good question. And notice it's a moral question, right?
Oh yeah, no, my dad actually seems to think that it's pretty probable that even if all of this is true, and there is a God and Jesus is God, he says, well, we don't know that he is doing it for the purposes which he says. And that even though on face value, it looks like from a Christian perspective that God is good, it could be that in reality he's evil, and therefore he doesn't want to worship. My dad doesn't want to worship him because he allowed for free will, because he allowed for people to exist that will go to hell.
Right, but your dad is presupposing a moral standard when he says that, number one. Number two, there's no way that evil can exist in the absence of good, because evil is a lack in a good thing. It's like cancer. If you take all the cancer out of a body, you got a better body. If you take all the body out of the cancer, you got nothing. So this is why C.S. Lewis has insightfully said that Christians have always seen the devil as a fallen angel, because even the devil is metaphysically good. He just uses his goodness to pursue badness, right? To do evil. Good only, or evil only exists if good exists. So ultimate reality can't be evil, because that would be nothing. Ultimate reality is good, and spoiled ultimate reality is what we call evil. Now, why would God create people he knew would go to hell is really the question. Well, first of all, I know I wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be here, none of us would be here if there weren't unbelievers. Why? Because I have unbelievers in my ancestry. I wouldn't even be here without them, right? And God put us on this earth to be his ambassadors, to create like he does, not in the same way, obviously, but to create. So we create other human beings. And through their free will, they get to make a choice as to whether to follow God or not. Now, God, ironically, can get his will done through unbelievers. Someone like Richard Dawkins writes a book. A Christian reads it and goes, oh, wow, I better get an answer to that. And now they start studying, and they wound up getting closer to God because of something an atheist did. In fact, I know this is a bit of a joke by my co-author, but Dr. Geisler, who knew more than I'll ever know, he's forgotten more than I'll ever know. He said he used to read atheists for devotions because he thought their arguments were encouraging to him. He said, this is all you got? So, I think that God can get his will done through evil. Now, suppose, I guess the question to ask, is God obligated to create no one if some people decide freely to reject God? That's the question. Is he obligated to create no one? Because, say, in other words, does God have to put up with the heckler's veto? That if he creates one guy who decides that he's going to shout God down and he's going to go his own way, that God can't create anyone? Is that what we're saying? Because that's what the argument seems to imply.
Yeah,
that's lost. Yeah. God can't create anyone. Well, why is that? I would also say this, and I know this maybe isn't often said, but people who reject God, first of all, God is going to put them at a level of punishment that is appropriate for their rejection, because God is just. Just like God is going to put people at a level of reward in heaven based on their behavior, because God is just. It would make no sense for God to put a garden variety Christian at the same level of reward as the Apostle Paul, right? That wouldn't be just. So, and the same thing is true with regard to heaven. You're not going to put a garden variety unbeliever at the same level of punishment as, say, Hitler. That wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be just. What we do know, since God is the standard of justice, that in the afterlife, no one is going to say, God, I got a raw deal. If I'd only known. God, I shouldn't be here. I should be there. And at the end, the bottom line is that God ultimately, whatever happens in the afterlife, it's just. You're not going to say, oh, that person shouldn't be in hell. No, you're going to say, if you had the knowledge God had, that person is right where that person should be, based on the choices he or she made.
I think our perspective assumes that God has to be good, and it's not been clear to me why the supreme being has to be good. So my dad has tried to counter what I've said by saying, well, it's possible that God could be evil. So therefore, even though the Bible makes it look like he's good, and even if you could show me a good apologist that can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, well, I don't know if maybe he still is actually evil. So can you touch on how do we know that God has to be perfect and good with no evil?
Well, for what I said before, that evil is a privation in good. It's like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of the car, you got a better car. If you take all the car out of the rust, nothing exists, right? So whatever is ultimate reality, it's good. Now, it's certainly possible that the God of the Bible is evil. But if that's the case, then there is a real God who isn't, because you wouldn't even know what evil was unless the real God is good. There would be no way to ground goodness, which means there'd be no way to have evil unless the ultimate standard is good. Because again, evil doesn't exist unless good exists. So it is possible that we have the wrong God. The God of the Bible isn't the true God. But it's not possible to say the God of the Bible is evil and there's no God. You see the point?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, he would agree with that point too.
Yeah. So I guess what I would do is, if he's hung up on this issue, and it is an issue to consider, I'm not blaming him for being hung up on it. I think probably the thing to do is go to John chapter 6 and see what Jesus says when he says, I'm the bread of life. Remember, he had just fed 5,000 people. He says, I'm the bread of life. And if you want to follow me, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. And it says many of the disciples said, this is hard teaching. We can't follow this guy anymore. And then Jesus turns to Peter, and Peter says, he says to Peter, are you going to leave too? And for once, Peter does not put his foot in his mouth. He actually says something very profound. He says, where else will we go? You hold the key to eternal life. If you're really doubting that the God of the Bible is the true God, just look at Jesus. Because if you look at Jesus, you can't really invent this character. In fact, my friend Tom Gilson just came out with a book called Too Good to Be False. I think that's the name of it, where he goes through and he just looks at the character of Jesus. You can't invent him no novelist could. The greatest novelist of all times couldn't have created a being like Jesus, a character like Jesus. He is the standard of what everyone wants to be. Even people in other faiths want to adopt Jesus. The Muslims want to take him. The Baha'is want to take him. The Hindus want to say we've got a Christ figure. So do the Buddhists. They're all looking to adopt Jesus. Why? Because he is as the writer of Hebrews puts it, if I can remember it properly, he is what's the actual phrase he uses? I can't remember the exact phrase the writer of Hebrews says, but basically, he is God in the flesh. He represents the true God. And I defy anyone to look at Jesus and say, well, Jesus is somehow immoral. He is what everyone wants to be. So if you're worried about these kinds of questions, just look at Jesus and remember what Peter said. Where else are we going to go? You have the key to eternal life.
I think, Tina, if I could say something just briefly, and this is just me speaking from experience and my own struggle with my own faith for 27 years, that I think sometimes in these discussions, we have far too low a view of what God's goodness is and far too high of a view. We think of evil in much more a stronger capacity than really is warranted. And we think of them as kind of in an equal sort of way. Evil is the opposite of goodness. But in truth, I think there's the necessity always of really considering what God's goodness is in the person of Jesus, and that goodness far outweighs any kind of vacuity of evil or any kind of evil. So evil's not on the same level as goodness. And I think for me, having that lower opinion or that lower idea of what God's goodness is oftentimes makes evil look more stronger than it is, or much more of a formidable opposition to our faith. And so for me, it's always reorienting and renewing my mind about what does it mean? What does God's goodness really mean? And so the severity of living that says that you don't talk to mere mortals. We're going to live forever, and the severity of God's goodness really outweighs any kind of evil. At least that's just my perspective.
Thank you for that, Dan. We got 5 questions left in about 15 minutes. So we'll try to pick up the pacing at these last couple in so we can be respectful of Frank's time. But Bill and Jackie, I don't know if it's Bill or Jackie, or maybe y'all are both going to ask a question at the same time, which would be very impressive. Anyway, the floor is yours.
I want to start with what an atheist is. By my definition, an atheist is somebody that doesn't believe in a God or a force that created the universe. Whereas an agnostic is somebody that doesn't necessarily disavow that there was a creator, but is unsure as to who or what that is. So if that's incorrect, from a standpoint of people in the group that consider themselves agnostic or atheist, correct me. But the point I'm trying to make is that atheists, again, somebody that denies a creator exists, often will present an argument disavowing the Bible. So it always seemed rather strange to me. If you deny that there is a God, why would you spend any time dealing with the Bible? Because you don't believe that the Bible's true. So if you don't believe that there's a God, why would you spend any time? But awful lot of the arguments that I hear are, you know, parts of the Bible are true, parts of the Bible couldn't be true, et cetera, et cetera. So it always seemed rather strange to me that those arguments would come forth. And the point I want to make is it's been said several times, but whether the Bible is true or false doesn't have anything to do with whether there's a creator God. The proof that there is a creator God is that we have something, that there's not, you know, that there's not nothing. And the fact is that primitive man that didn't have an understanding of atoms and gravity and light rays, pretty much, as far as I know, we've never uncovered a society that didn't believe that there was a creator. So there must be something inherent in creation that caused people to believe that something created it. And people, we were talking about good and evil, people assumed that everything was good. There wasn't anything such as a bad water or a bad tree or a bad rock. Everything was, or a bad animal, everything was good. So the fact that there is something rather than nothing proves to me that there has to be something that created it. And regardless of what you think that was, most everybody comes to the conclusion that you know, when you stumble upon a painting or something, you automatically assume that something did that. And you might not like the painting, but you'd say it was good because somebody did it. You know, they took a canvas and they put something on it. So I don't know if I'm making any sense, but that's the point I'm trying to bring forth here.
Bill,
first
well,
step,
I personally agree. You know, if there is, if there is something has always existed. The question is it the universe or something outside the universe? And the evidence seems to show, as even atheists are admitting, that the universe had a beginning. So whatever created space, time, and matter must transcend space, time, and matter. In other words, the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, and intelligent, as I mentioned before. But let me just draw a distinction between what you said, atheism and agnostics and theists. And we could argue over labels and semantics all day. I just like to ask this question to try and get right to the point. And the question is this: here's the proposition. God exists. Do you agree with that proposition? Do you disagree with that proposition? Or don't you know? If you agree, obviously you're a theist. If you disagree, you're an atheist. If you don't know, you're an agnostic. That seems to cover all the bases there. So instead of arguing over semantics, I think if you just ask that question, you can get right to the point pretty quickly.
right. So you've got three groups, which is what I said, you know?
Yes.
So, okay.
I know, but some people are going to talk about lacking a belief in God and all that, and you can argue that all day. I think it's just easier to say, here's the proposition. Do you agree, disagree, or don't know? Just go from there.
Right. I mean, I can argue for the existence of a creator. I can't argue with somebody that says, well, I don't believe in the Christian God. And my response is, okay, fine, don't. I mean, you know, I don't care whether you believe in the Christian God. I do. But if you say that the universe exists and doesn't have a reason for that exist, I look at you and I say, well, you know, I can't come to that conclusion logically, and it seems like that most people agree with me. And all primitive tribes, they all believed in spirits and the Great Spirit and something that created everything, and it was good. I mean, I don't think any primitive tribe ever existed that thought everything was bad. So, you know.
Yeah, I just add one thing to that, Bill, is that you want to say something would have to create that itself is a prime cause or uncreated, because you have that follow-up question. The atheists like to say, well, then who made God? And then you're stacking turtles. So what we're talking about is an uncaused cause that's a prime cause that is the a necessary being. So Brady, we got the next one.
Yes, we get the next one. George, our very own George. It's you, buddy.
Your very own George.
Hi, Dr. Turek. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, George.
My question concerns something that you had said earlier today. You were talking about the disciples and how their Jewish worldview was not that the resurrection was going to happen in the middle of time to just one person, right? It was going to happen to everybody, and that was going to be at the end of time. So their worldview really wouldn't have had the stuff it needed to have for them to either make up or accidentally hallucinate Jesus' resurrection, because they wouldn't have thought of resurrection in those terms. Now, my question for you has to do with Jesus' predictions of his own death and resurrection. Say, for the sake of argument, that Jesus was a very creative, whatever else you might say about him, he was a very creative religious teacher or whatever, and he came up with this novel idea of the resurrection, and he put it in his disciples' heads so that, you know, maybe after he died, they either grief hallucinated it and then had it that way, or, you know, made it up or whatever. The made it up hallucination part isn't the point. The point is that could Jesus have put that in their minds prior to his death?
Well, they seem to have, if you're believing their testimony, not understood what he said while it was happening. You know, what's he talking about here? In fact, that's one reason Jesus scolded Peter when Jesus said, I'm going to die and rise again. And Peter basically says, no, you're not going to do that. And he says, get behind me, Satan. There's another one of those embarrassing pieces of testimony that they never would have invented. They wouldn't have the Lord calling the leader of the disciples Satan, right? But they do. In fact, that's another embarrassing detail. How many times did the New Testament writers depict themselves as dim-witted, right? They don't get Jesus's mission. They don't understand what he's doing. In fact, they don't really understand his mission until he's already ascended to heaven. You know, at that point, they go, wow, I could have had a V8, right? But up to that point, they don't get it, which doesn't comport well with them trying to pass off a lie as the truth. They're just telling the truth here. Even if he were able to plant this idea in their mind, I don't know what kind of fruit that would have borne. Would they then run out and say he had resurrected from the dead, even though he hadn't, and then be excommunicated, beaten, tortured, and killed for it, never recant? It doesn't seem to make any sense to me. So I think they realized what he was saying well after he had resurrected from the dead and ascended to heaven. Then they went, and then they went and searched the scriptures and said, this is what he meant when he was quoting Isaiah 53. We got it now. All right. We didn't get it when he said it, but we got it. Now, this is what he meant when he said, just as Jonah's 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, so I'll be, or in the belly of the fish, I'll be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Got it now.
So he could have planted that idea in their minds, and they didn't get it right away, but sometime after his death, after some more reflection, they might have made the connection of what Jesus was trying to say.
I don't think it was reflection. I think it was the resurrection and then the ascension, and then they went, all right.
Okay. Well, you and I agree on that. I'm trying to hypothetical naturalistic explanation here, and just in the research I've been doing, it seems like you have to somehow have Jesus' body go missing one way or another, and then you have to have the disciples, like maybe Peter has a grief hallucination or something like that, where he sees, you know, the risen Lord, and then he tells it to the disciples, and then there's some kind of like group hysteria thing going on. do what you want with that. I was wondering if we could just say, even if they hallucinated, they wouldn't have hallucinated a resurrected Jesus because their worldview would have precluded it. But if Jesus could have put the idea in their head to begin with, I don't know if we can do that.
Well, and as you know, one of the problems with the hallucination theory is it doesn't explain the empty tomb, because easily the Romans and the Jews could have ended Christianity if people were hallucinating, and people don't have group hallucinations either, just like we don't have group dreams. So, in fact, this is one of the problems. If you follow this going on right now in the New Testament scholar world, which many are not Christians, as you know, people like Bart Ehrman don't even take a naturalistic explanation anymore, because they know every naturalistic explanation they come up with has holes. So all they do is they say, well, we don't know what happened, but it wasn't a resurrection, because you can't prove a resurrection through the study of history. That this is just a philosophical presupposition they make. And so they don't even take an alternative theory anymore. They're not trying to explain it. They're just saying it wasn't a resurrection.
Thank you, Dr. Turek.
Thank you. Good question.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Hey, we've run out of time. I know there's about 3 of you that we didn't get to, but we need to respect the time. So James, I'm going to throw it back to you now.
Yeah, thanks so much. I want to say thank you, Frank. Thank you, everybody that's here. I know over half of you are new to the club, and I want to say welcome. The whole thing about the martyrdom of the early disciples, or we can verify apparently some of them, might be something for a future book club. Candida Moss, a professor of New Testament early Christianity at Notre Dame, has written a book called The Myth of Persecution, How Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom. And then Sean McDowell did, I think, his PhD dissertation on the subject, and has also written a book about can we account, do we know what happened? Did the disciples actually die martyr deaths? And that might be a good before and after, a point counterpoint rather, book to deal with later in the club. I did want to remind you, if I can, that we will have John Loftus joining us for his book, The Case Against Miracles. That's going to be our January book club. Then in February, we're going to do the Lee Strobel book, The Case for Miracles, kind of get a point counterpoint on that. I want to encourage you to get those books, start reading them, have your questions ready. We had, I think, 19 people offer to help with some of the expenses. Even to buy a bigger room costs about $600 a year with doing the Zoom meeting this way. So if you guys want to help on that, and you did that, the link I put in the notes, and that should take you right there to that. Again, Frank, thank you so much for being part of our Atheist and Christian Book Club. It was delightful, a good conversation. I have this fear of doing it online, that everybody's going to get into some kind of meltdown shouting match. That was not the case at all. Good conversation, good discussion. Thanks so much, and we hope to have you back at a future Atheist and Christian Book Club.
My pleasure, James. Thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone for their dialogue. I thought it was very good, and it's always, for me anyway, energizing to talk about these things. So thank you for being interested. I wish more in our country were interested in these things, but unfortunately that's not the case. So thank you for what you're doing.
Well, we are diverse in our positions, but what we all agree on is we want to get outside of our echo chambers. We want to give thoughtful processing of people that we don't agree with, to hear people that have different, diverse worldviews, and be able to share that. So thanks so much for being part of the club. Again, if you want to catch past clubs on videos, you can watch those at our book club website, which is atheistchristianbookclub.com. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you very much. Hey, is John Loftus still on?
Hey, John, are you there?
There you go.
I just wanted to
He's
mention, I'm good at math, and neither am I, because there's 3 kinds of people in the world: those that can count and those that can't.
Wow. Thank you
for that.
Thanks for the dad joke.
All right.
Frank Turek, everyone.
And we will catch you guys next month. Thanks so much. And bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.